Good evening. We thought we'd take a slightly different approach tonight than the normal lecture because this book is full of so many great stories, and it's hard to talk to you about it with just a lecture. So Mark and I decided that we would start with just basically a conversation and get it started with some very basic kind of questions that will help him to communicate all the stories that are in the book, or some of the better ones anyway. Okay, so let's start with the obvious, Mark. Why did you write this book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's just an honor to be here. And Heath, thank you for that remarkable introduction. I wrote this book, and Heath mentioned it, some of the great historians who have sunk their teeth into Lyndon Johnson, Robert Caro, Robert Dallek, Michael Beschloss, Doris Kearns Goodwin. All these great historians have taken their turn at Lyndon Johnson. And I think it's, for an historian, writing about Lyndon Johnson is like an actor playing King Lear. There is so much in that role, and it can be interpreted in so many different ways. And I think that's Lyndon Johnson. You have every attribute, every characteristic in Lyndon Johnson, and you have so much in the 1960s. So it's sort of this endlessly fascinating subject to delve into. But I think the accounts that I've read of LBJ, Terry, are sort of unduly skewed, given the rich tapestry of LBJ's life and personality. They tend to be more negative in orientation. And you can do that with Lyndon Johnson because he is everything. There's John Connolly, who is an aide to LBJ, said, there isn't an adjective in the dictionary that wouldn't describe Lyndon Johnson. So you can take the most negative aspect, a narrow aspect of who he was, and construct a factually accurate but imbalanced account of this giant personality. So I've written an oral biography that draws on the oral history accounts of friends and advocates, as well as enemies and adversaries, to get a full portrait of who this man was and what he meant to our country.
So it's been 39 years. It's hard to believe for us that remember. It's been 35 years since LBJ passed away. And yet historians still argue over the cornerstone of his legacy. Is it the domino theory that brought us Vietnam, or is it the economic decisions that he made, the domestic policy decisions that he made, that in many aspects are the peak of what one might call modern liberalism? Which is it?
I think probably a little mixture of both. And I think that Clara Booth Luce, who is the wife of the founder of Time magazine, Henry Luce, a playwright in her own right, she said one time, she used to famously lecture presidents. She'd say, you will be remembered in one sentence. What's your sentence? And she would illustrate. She would say, Lincoln, he freed the slave. And she used to do it so often that John F. Kennedy was just so bothered by it, he would avoid her at parties. But she's right. She's right. Presidents are more or less remembered in one sentence. And I think that at this point, to this point, LBJ's sentence certainly has had Vietnam in it. In fact, it's only had Vietnam in it. Because so many other people are credited with the remarkable sweep of legislation that LBJ put into effect. But as the long, dark shadow of Vietnam recedes with the passing of years, I think slowly we'll see LBJ turn into the Vietnam president to the civil rights president. And if you look at the most inherent contradiction in this country before the 1960s, it was all men are created equal. It was an intrinsic part of the American creed. It was in our Declaration of Independence. And yet until the 1960s, we had legal apartheid in this country. Heath, you just mentioned I think a very underrated speech from LBJ where he was talking about voting rights and the importance for African Americans after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 went forward to register their choices at the ballot box. But we didn't have equal rights in this country until this man made it happen through, it sounds like a pitch from my book, and maybe it is, through indomitable will. There isn't anybody who could affect civil rights in this country before LBJ. So I think that the tide is starting to change. LBJ's sentence will always have Vietnam in it, but I think that civil rights will be an effective counterbalance to Vietnam.
Usually at directors' meetings, Mark is our favorite storyteller of LBJ stories. Some of them we can't necessarily talk about here today. However, the book also is full of some really, really great stories. Tell them.
Well, he's such a colorful character, you know, and that's why it's important to have an oral history, I think, because you get so many people telling the stories about this giant of a person. I'll give you a couple. He was really, really funny. And there wasn't a story that he couldn't relate to his own experience. If you came to the Oval Office and you had a problem that you were wrestling with, he would often tell a joke. And so his speechwriters were meeting with him one time. And he's reading the speech and it quoted Socrates. And he looked at me and said, "Socrates? Socrates? I'm not going to quote Socrates." He said, "Keep the quote, but begin it with, 'My daddy used to say.'" And there's another one that relates to speechwriters. And he had John Kenneth Galbraith in the Oval Office one day, and Galbraith was imploring him to do a speech on the economy. He said, people want to know that their economy is sound. They want to know what your policy on the economy is. You should give a speech to the American public about the economy. And he said, "You know, Ken, a president giving a speech on the economy is kind of like a fella peeing down his own leg." He said, "It gives him a warm feeling, but no one else knows what the hell he's doing." One more story that there's this a lot of misconceptions about LBJ. One of them was that he was ruthless, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a little bit, Terry. But the other thing is he was hard to work for, and that is certainly true. But LBJ was also incredibly loyal, and that's one of the things that people don't realize. And he used to talk to his staff about there being 10 important things. The 10 most important things in politics are loyalty, loyalty, loyalty. He'd say loyalty 10 times. But there's one story that I'd never heard before that illustrates this. In the waning days of his administration, he was really worried that everyone would land on their feet. And he was less worried about policy. All those days were sort of over. But he wanted to make sure that everyone, after leaving the White House, had a good job. And there was a guy named DeVere Pearson who was one of the White House counsels, a lawyer in the White House. And he was interviewing with a great white shoe firm in Los Angeles about opening a Washington office. It was a great opportunity for him. And LBJ was an incredible micromanager. And DeVere Pearson more or less signed out of the White House. He made it clear that he wasn't going to be there the next day. And he's meeting in Los Angeles with this firm behind closed doors with all the partners. And a secretary runs into the conference room. She's really flustered. She said, "Mr. Pearson, the president's on the line for you." And so the partners all said, "You know what? You take the call. We'll clear the room. You take the call. You let us know when we're done, and we'll reconvene." So he gets on the line. He says, "Mr. President?" John says, "Yes." He says, "Well, Mr. President, I don't know if you noticed, I signed out of the White House. I'm not going to be there today." He said, "I know that." He said, "Well, then, Mr. President, what can I do for you?" He says, "No, I didn't have anything. I just thought the call would help." So again, I think there's a side of LBJ that everybody who knew him can tell you about, but I don't think is adequately reflected in most of the books, at least, that I have read.
Okay, there's plenty more. But I suppose we should get back to being a bit more serious. LBJ served only 24 months of JFK's term. So under the provisions of the 22nd Amendment, LBJ could have run again in 1968, making him the second longest serving president, only beating FDR by a few years. Why didn't he run?
Well, let me just ask the crowd, and I'll answer the question, Terry. It's a good one. And there are a lot of misconceptions about why he didn't run. I'll get into that in a second. But who here remembers LBJ giving a very famous speech on March 31st in which he said, and you can probably quote it with me, I will not seek, and I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. How many of you who heard that were shocked by it? It was shocking for most people. And the misconception is that LBJ was more or less waving the white flag because of Vietnam, that he was beleaguered and embattled, and that has finally taken his toll, and he said, I've had enough. I'm not going to risk losing the office and being humiliated, I'm going to step down. That's patently untrue. The reason that he did not run again is because he had a genetically weak heart. And he was very conscious of the fact that his grandfather and father had died in their early 60s. And he also was conscious of the fact that Americans, that there were other American presidents who were in ill health, who put the country through a crisis by continuing to serve. Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Woodrow Wilson, of course, survived a stroke, although he was unable to serve for a good long time. And of course, FDR died early into his fourth term in office. But LBJ thought of not running in 1964 for the same reasons. He had had a massive heart attack in 1955. It was nearly fatal. It took him 6 months to recover from the heart attack, and he could feel his heart every day. Literally, he could feel the heaviness of his heart. So he was pretty sure he was going to die in his early 60s, and indeed he did. He died 4 years and 2 days after leaving office in January of 1969, he died of heart failure. So that was the big reason. But the other reason, and he had decided in the summer of 1967 he was pretty sure he would step down. There was a little ambiguity, and he wrestled with it after that. But he was pretty sure he'd step down. Moreover, he had come to that conclusion in 1968 because he desperately wanted to strike an honorable peace in Vietnam. He did not want to be remembered as a war president. He desperately wanted to find a way out. And he realized that his declining to run for re-election would send a signal to Ho Chi Minh that he was serious about the peace process. And indeed, it did bring Ho Chi Minh to the bargaining table. And unfortunately, peace eluded LBJ. But the popular, the popular wisdom is that he was afraid he would lose. I'm convinced, and LBJ was convinced, that had he run for re-election, he probably would have beat Richard Nixon. And if you look at the fact that Nixon beat Hubert Humphrey by less than half of a percentage point in the popular vote, it's probably true. But LBJ was also conscious of the fact that it would further divide the nation. And he didn't think that would be good for the country.
Well, if I'm doing the math right, if he died 4 years and 2 days, if he would have been reelected, he would have died 2 days after leaving office.
Which is remarkable. Yeah.
Which is remarkable.
There are a lot of people who say he probably would have lived a while after that, because after he left office, he more or less let himself go. He started smoking again. He started drinking liberally. He grew his hair out. He just really unplugged. He let his diet go, and it probably didn't do his health any good. So he may well.
Well, it was.
Yeah.
Flower power.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. The 10 years of LBJ and JFK seem to be in constant conflict, perceived by everyone to be in conflict. How do you distinguish the two, and do you really think they are in that much conflict?
I don't think that their legacies are. I think it's funny, people pick a lane. They either go with Kennedy or they go with Johnson, and sort of ne'er the twain shall meet. But in fact, I think that they are wholly complementary legacies, historical legacies. Liz Carpenter, who also, like Clare Boothe Luce, believed that presidents could be encapsulated in one word, said that Kennedy inspired, Liz Carpenter was an aide to Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, and just a remarkable wit. But she said that Kennedy inspired, which Johnson was incapable of doing, and Johnson delivered. And it's true. If you look at what Kennedy had envisioned for this country, it's not Kennedy who got it done for us. It was LBJ. I'll give you an example, and that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the act that essentially ends Jim Crow in the United States of America. JFK had proposed it in 1963 as the Civil Rights Act of 1963. But there's very little doubt in my mind that he would not have gotten that through Congress. I don't think that Southern Democrats would have allowed a Northeastern liberal to get that done. LBJ got it done. And just as there's the old cliche that it took Nixon, the staunch anti-communist, to open China, it took Lyndon Johnson, this Texan, to give us civil rights. There's this great story about Senator Richard Russell from Georgia, who was a friend and mentor to LBJ and a fierce opponent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, coming to the White House and talking to LBJ about it. And LBJ realizes he's going to have to run over his old friend in order to get this through. And he has no compunctions about doing it. But Russell opens up by saying, you know, you can get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. I don't think Kennedy could have done it, but you can do it. But I warn you, if you do, you'll lose the southern states to the Republicans, and you may well not win election in 1964. And Johnson, this perceived power monger, listens to that and quietly responds, if that is the price for this bill, I will gladly pay. That's just remarkable political courage. But importantly, he used Kennedy's martyrdom in order to get it passed, as he would exploit any tactic in order to get something that he felt passionately about passed. He used Kennedy's martyrdom to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He used the bloody events of Selma in the civil rights struggle to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which Heath talked about earlier, and he used the martyrdom of Martin Luther King to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This is a man with enormous legislative prowess and persuasive abilities that I think are unmatched. He got things done. Kennedy envisioned them and inspired America around them. So I think they're wholly complementary.
Speaking of that, what do you think this present day Congress and White House could learn from LBJ?
Well, it's interesting because I mentioned the misconception that LBJ was ruthless earlier. We had an interview with NPR earlier, and I was talking about this, the fact that so many people think he was ruthless. In fact, there's a Newsweek article right now by David Frum called What Obama Can Learn from LBJ. And in the headline is this, here that LBJ was a politician of unmatched ruthlessness. We don't get things done by being ruthless in Washington. The article goes on to talk about how conciliatory he was in getting things done. That's how you get things done. And that's why he was effective. And to my mind, there were the 3 C's. And this is what Congress can learn, and Obama can learn from the 36th President of the United States. One is craftiness. If you can't get around an opponent, set a strategy to circumvent them. But if you do that, if you do work your way around them, and there are innumerable examples of LBJ doing that. Let me give you a quick one. When he passed Medicare in 1965, he was opposed not only by Congress, but by the American Medical Association. And a lot of congressmen and senators were opposed to it because they were being lobbied so effectively by the AMA. So he calls them to the ranch where he was for several weeks. And he has this meeting with the AMA. And he asked the president of the AMA if he would send doctors to Vietnam to tend to the civilian population. And he says, of course we'll do that, Mr. President. So immediately, LBJ calls a press conference, knowing full well that they're going to ask whether the AMA will support Medicare legislation. And LBJ is totally conscious of that. But he announces the fact that they're going to send doctors to Vietnam. And sure enough, someone says to the president of the AMA, will you support Medicare when it goes through? And LBJ says, of course he's going to support Medicare. I mean, these guys are sending doctors overseas in harm's way to tend to the civilian population. These are patriots. Of course they're going to support the law of the land. And then put on the spot, the president of the AMA says, of course we're going to obey the law. So LBJ did not vilify them. He did not demonize them, but he effectively worked around them. So craftiness is important. Collegiality is just as important. You don't demonize or vilify your opponent because you know what? You might have to work with that same person the next go-around when you have something else that needs to be passed. And finally, compromise. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where Barbara Bush said that compromise in Washington has become a dirty word, that reaching across the aisle has become tantamount to treason. Well, that's the only way you get things done in Washington. And I think that's what you can learn from LBJ, that he was a master at those three things: craftiness, collegiality, and compromise.
Okay, so since you're at the Clinton Library, you have to know this one's coming. In one of your other books, Second Acts, you discuss the post-presidency of many of the late 20th century presidents. You interviewed them, and so you have a pretty good idea of how they think and what they said. So compare, if you can, LBJ and Bill Clinton.
That's an easy comparison in a lot of ways. There are a lot of differences, but there are some striking similarities. One is, I think in most of our lifetimes, there are only two bigger-than-life presidents, and they are LBJ and Bill Clinton, in my view. They're charismatic presidents, but you don't get bigger-than-life personalities like you do LBJ and Bill Clinton. Second is that part and parcel of that is their complexity. They are just so broad in terms of personality and in terms of traits that it's difficult to define them by using even several adjectives. They're just enormously complex. And finally, they were both incredibly persuasive. I think Bill Clinton was far better behind a podium. I mean, there's no one who's quite as good in my lifetime as Bill Clinton. He's just so good. I remember I was at a function in the waning days of the Clinton presidency after we had gone through the Lewinsky scandal and stuff. And I was sitting with this staunch Republican at a dinner at which Bill Clinton spoke. And this passionate Republican looks over to me and says, "Oh my God, does he have to leave?" He was just so good. He was so good. So LBJ wasn't particularly good in front of a camera. It's paradoxically, he would become this sort of Eastern establishment figure that he sort of found contemptible behind the scenes. He constructed his personality in a way that he thought was presidential, but was actually inauthentic, and he was not particularly effective. But behind the scenes, he was incredibly effective at changing people's minds, and I think that's a quality that he shares with the 42nd president.
Okay, and the final question is, how can we help? Can everyone help? And what can you do next to help explain to every American citizen living and breathing today, decisions that LBJ made affect each and every one of their lives? Between the EPA, if the water you drink is clean, it's because of LBJ. If you are a minority and you vote, it's very likely that it's because of LBJ. We can go on and on. If Medicare, if you're elderly and not poor and not sent to the poorhouse, it's because of LBJ. There isn't anyone. The Education Act, I mean, I can go on, I can't think of all of them now because we're running out of time thinking of all of them. Every single human being, and yet when I listen to the talking heads and they talk about Medicare and there's no longer poor elderly, nobody says his name.
Yeah.
How do we change that?
I don't know. I think he's largely a forgotten president, and I do think that is slowly starting to change. The first line of my book is, history in its most cursory form is often a beauty contest. And if you look at who we remember most favorably, it is those presidents who are most visionary, eloquent, and attractive. John F. Kennedy is a great example of that. He looks like he sprung from the pages of a J. Crew catalog. And you look at images of him today and the way he speaks and how charismatic and telegenic he is. And we want him to be great. We want to believe that he's the one who gave us civil rights, that he's the one who gave us some sweeping legislative reform. He's not. And as I mentioned, LBJ would win no beauty contests. But to your point, Terry, what he did is remarkable. I have in my office at the LBJ Library a shadow box containing the pens of all the pens that he used to sign bills into law in 1 year, 1965. And I would argue that it is the most important year legislatively for modern America. Because in that one case, you have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act, which bring federal aid to education for the first time and fundamentally increase graduation rates in high school and college. You have Clean Air, the Clean Air Act. You have a Highway Beautification Act, the Immigration Act, which is the most sweeping immigration reform in U.S. history and fundamentally changes the heart and soul of America by offering our promise to those in non-European countries in bigger numbers. You have the Voting Rights Act, the most important civil rights legislation, period. You do not have Barack Obama sitting in the Oval Office without the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You have Arts and Humanities, which creates the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. You have Medicare, all this stuff in one single year. And people don't realize that about LBJ because they associate him generally with one thing, Vietnam. So I don't know how to answer your question, Terry, but I do think that people are more often crediting him for things in particular now with civil rights.
Okay. Well, are there any questions in the audience?
Thank you. I was wondering to get a comparison between LBJ's response to disaster relief versus George Bush and Katrina.
Yeah, LBJ had his own crisis in that area of the world, and it's not something that is often mentioned. It wasn't often mentioned during Katrina, but he went to the site immediately. He walked among the rubble. He talked to the people. He had federal relief in there immediately. I know Bush had his own problems and has his own explanation for it, but LBJ was great in a crisis. And you see that post Kennedy assassination, after the Kennedy assassination. He was remarkable at mobilizing everybody. And I don't think that we could have had a better crisis manager in the White House at that point. Liz Carpenter, who I mentioned earlier, was on that flight from Dallas back to Washington with him. And a phrase kept on going through her mind. She had been with Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson when Johnson was vice president, and Mrs. Johnson's brother unexpectedly died. And LBJ got on the phone and immediately started figuring things out. Someone was going to get the body. They were going to do everything was worked out within the course of 20 minutes. And Mrs. Johnson says to Liz Carpenter, "Lyndon's a good man to have around in a crisis." And that phrase kept on turning around in her mind. And she said when they got back to Washington, she realized that our country was never without a president, that he did all the right things that day and thereafter to ensure that we were stable during a very difficult time. The one crisis that he didn't manage particularly well was Vietnam. And again, I think that's a fair part of his legacy for a variety of reasons, but but it wasn't managed well.
Stephanie? There's a mic.
Mark, I know hopefully several people here have been to the LBJ Library to see your exhibits, but I know you're undergoing a renovation of your exhibits, and I was wondering if you could tell us when that will be finished and maybe share a little insight on perhaps how in your exhibit redo you may sharpen some of these stories to really give LBJ the credit he deserves for all the sweeping legislation you just talked about, or maybe just tell us a little bit about how you're changing your exhibits, because I think it's really interesting.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'd be happy to. We are embarking on a $10 million renovation of our core exhibit on the life and legacy of the 36th president. And we're doing it because we really haven't had a refresh on the exhibit in about 15 years. And technology has come a long way, and young people in particular learn in very different ways through different media. And we want to offer that to them to tell this story. But moreover, since we last did the renovation, a renovation on the exhibit, we've released the telephone tapes of LBJ. So, which I use liberally in my book, because they really effectively tell the story of his administration in their totality and really show how he effectively did the business of his presidency. So there will be 15 stations around the exhibit where you'll hear, when you go to the civil rights section, him talking to Martin Luther King about the importance of the Voting Rights Act. You'll hear him talking about Vietnam with McGeorge Bundy and his ambivalence about the war. You'll hear him in his own words, which I think is so vitally important in any exhibit, but particularly with this president. The telephone to Lyndon Johnson was practically an appendage. You know, in this day and age, he would have 3 or 4 cell phones going. He would love what technology offers in terms of one's ability to communicate. But to answer your question about the legacy part, Stephanie, we will have an interactive table which will show how the LBJ administration impacts your life today. So you might have Big Bird on the table, and you'll press that, and it'll talk about him passing the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 and how that created National Public Radio and PBS, among other things. So that interactivity is really an important part of this brand new exhibit. And we hope you'll come down and see it. We'll cut the ribbon on December 1 of this year. Yeah.
And now, is this the same taping system that in a couple of years would give us a different form of history? And the last. So this is the last good set of tapes that we are going to have as a country, correct?
Well, it's a great story. No one knew about the existence of very few people knew about the existence of these tapes, including Lady Bird Johnson. And after LBJ died, his assistant went to Harry Middleton, who was my predecessor, who was the director of the LBJ Library for 31 years and had been a speechwriter for LBJ in the White House. And she told him about the existence of these tapes. And he realized he was sitting on this treasure trove of information, but was conscious of the fact that LBJ had put a 50-year seal on the conversations. 50 years after his death, they could be opened, which would mean that we'd be opening these in 2023, not in the late 1990s when we actually opened them. And the reason it changed is because Harry Middleton went to Lady Bird Johnson, told her about the tapes, and she, this is remarkable to me, unflinchingly said, open them, process them, open them, give them to the public. She didn't insist on listening to them first. She just said, do it. And the great thing is that they really do vindicate LBJ's legacy in the same way that they incriminate Richard Nixon. And, you know, and there's even a tape on there. I use this in the book. You may have heard this tape. It's LBJ calling Joe Hagar, the founder of the scion of the Hagar Slacks Company in Dallas, Texas. And he custom orders 6 pairs of pants, giving very specific anatomical detail. And you couldn't invent this conversation. I mean, you could, if you saw this on Saturday Night Live, you'd say, oh, that's preposterous. That could never happen. But he talks, again, very specifically about why he wants the crotch longer, why the pockets have to be longer. It's remarkable. So there are some things in the tapes that are not particularly flattering, but overall, they give a real glimpse into the personality of this man and how effective he was, particularly as a legislator.
You should hear him tell that story without the public. I've heard that. I've heard, yeah, there was, yeah. The other version is.
You got to hear it. By the way, but at the very end of the conversation, Joe Harris is totally taken aback that he's getting a call from the 36th President of the United States. And it shows his penchant for micromanagement as well as his tendency toward crudity. But at the very end, Joe Hager says, well, Mr. President, we'll get on that right. LBJ says, now, there's nothing more important than these pants. You got to get them to me right. Nothing more important in the world. Not Vietnam, not civil rights. But he literally says that. And Joe Hager said, well, we'll get them to you right away, Mr. President. Where should we send them? And he says, White House, click.
Yes?
My name is Warigia Bowman, and I teach here at the Clinton School. And I had the privilege of writing a paper for Elspeth Rostow using the LBJ tapes about civil rights. And I was very moved emotionally by what I heard in terms of his sincerity, in terms of speaking with black leaders. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you've heard in terms of his reaching out to black leaders in that time period?
There are two conversations thank you for the question. There are two conversations with Martin Luther King that are my favorite among all of them. Well, maybe that Hagar Slacks conversation for different reasons. But one is on what was the second full day of LBJ's presidency, November 25th, 1963. He calls Martin Luther King, and just as he called civic leaders and legislators and anyone who was important during the few days after the assassination, to make sure that he was uniting all Americans after the tragedy of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And Martin Luther King says to him, he was pretty clever himself. He says, Mr. President, there's no greater way of honoring John F. Kennedy than to enact some of the progressive policies that he sought to initiate. That's a direct quote. And LBJ says, well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that. And Martin, if you have any ideas about this stuff, I want you to come see me. And he made good on that promise. He really did listen to civil rights leaders. John F. Kennedy did not bring, and I'm not disparaging Kennedy, but he did not bring civil rights leaders to the White House. And I'll go to the second conversation about King, which is around voting rights in 1965. In January, they have 2 months before the bloody events in Selma, Alabama. He has a conversation with King about the importance of voting rights. And you can see them working together. He says LBJ says to Martin Luther King, Martin, if you get your people, your civil rights workers, soldiers, to go into the worst parts of the South and try to register to vote and show the media and consequently the American people how difficult it is to do that. And this is a direct quote. There isn't a man who drives a tractor in this country who won't say, that isn't right, that isn't fair. And Martin Luther King says to LBJ, if you get voting rights, Mr. President, you're going to increase your base in the South. You're going to have a lot of Democratic voters. So they're working together, and they're urging each other on. And that's exactly how we got the Voting Rights Act. And there's this great, I think the most underrated speech, I think, Heath, you mentioned this in your introduction. The most underrated speech in American history comes after the events of Selma, Alabama, when LBJ goes before Congress in the shadow of a statue of Abraham Lincoln. And he talks about how difficult it is for the average African American in this country and what they might face as plights on a daily basis. And he says, and we shall overcome. And he was invoking what became the anthem of the civil rights movement, the lines from a Negro spiritual. And John Lewis talks about listening to that speech in Alabama with Martin Luther King, and that being the only time he ever saw Martin Luther King shed tears. And King hears the most important man in the country using those words, which meant that he had heard the cries and the sorrow from that oppressed people, and he understood what needed to be done. So it's a remarkable story. And those two phone conversations, I think in particular, are I think the most important in the collection from an historical standpoint.
Oh dear. There's one right there. Hang, just a second.
May I just say,
microphone's
I
coming.
did not see, this is Christy Carpenter, and I did not invoke Liz Carpenter twice today because I knew her daughter was sitting in the audience.
Anyway, thank you for
But
doing
I did
so.
not see you. This is Christy Carpenter, the daughter of the great Liz Carpenter.
Thank you. Anyway, you haven't talked at all about the war on poverty. And this was, of course, the war that LBJ really wanted to fight, not the war in Vietnam. And, I think particularly from today's perspective, when we can imagine what would happen to a politician who said, who even started talking about poverty. It's just become so far off of the spectrum of acceptable issues among presidential candidates, which is really just, I think, a very bad sign about where we are today as a nation. But can you talk a little bit about Johnson and the war on poverty and any thoughts you have about it?
Yeah, of course. It was interesting. Tavis Smiley did a commentary on CBS Sunday Morning a few months ago, maybe about 8 months ago now, in which he praised Robert Kennedy for bringing up the issue of poverty in when he was running for office running for the presidency in 1968. And Robert Kennedy went to Appalachia and walked among the rural poor in order to exemplify how deeply poverty penetrated in this country. But he didn't mention LBJ, and much to my chagrin. LBJ, 4 years earlier, had gone before the country in his State of the Union address and declared an unconditional war on poverty. And it was no more, to your point, Christy, it was no more popular an issue then than it is today. But at the time, 22%, over 1/5 of all Americans lived below the poverty line. And he not only declared a war on poverty, but he made it happen by sweeping legislation, various and sundry means, of which Medicare was one law. It was really part of the war on poverty. Because 1/3 of all Americans over 65 lived in poverty. At the end of LBJ's 5 years and 2 months in the Oval Office, poverty had declined from 22% to 13%. By far the biggest one-time reduction in the history of our country. And it remains at about 13% today. It hasn't changed much. Went to about 15% during the Reagan administration, had declined to as low as 11% during the Nixon administration. But he was very serious about poverty. And again, Medicare is an example of that. He could not in good conscience see many people in the vernacular of the time go to the poorhouse in their latter years, unable to afford medical care. FDR had tried to pass Medicare. Harry Truman had tried to pass Medicare. John F. Kennedy tried to pass Medicare. And LBJ made it happen. He hated poverty. He'd seen it firsthand. And he hated bigotry for the same reasons.
I think we probably have time for one more. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if you would say a few words about someone who I think may be almost as equally as important as LBJ himself, and that's Lady Bird Johnson. What was their relationship like, and what kind of impact did she have on his behavior and thoughts?
It's a great question. I don't think people realize the symbiotic relationship between the two of them. I don't know that you find a more holistic partnership between both of them. Again, I mentioned that LBJ was very difficult to work with, and there's no denying that. He was really tough. He was good on some days, but he was really difficult on other days. And what people don't realize is that you didn't work for just one Johnson, you kind of worked for two. And that LBJ was part of a greater package that included the ever gracious Lady Bird. And she said that I learned to walk behind Lyndon and say thank you. And they were very much a team. one of the things that's interesting is one of the and I thought about this, thought about their relationship long and hard, and I think, and I don't take a lot of time to write. I don't labor over sentences, but I thought about how to encapsulate their partnership, and I came up with a sentence that I think, to my mind, describes it aptly, and it is that one wonders whether Johnson let his demons graze, knowing that she would ward them off by quietly summoning his better angels. And I think she did have that calming force on him. She forced him to look beyond the heat of the moment. Her equanimity sort of quieted his raging storms at times. And she also had an enormous effect on legislation. LBJ is enormously important environmentally. There's no more important president in my lifetime in terms of protection of the environment. The only president who had a deeper effect environmentally is Theodore Roosevelt. But it was largely inspired by Lady Bird's passion for the subject. And she's credited for highway beautification, which sounds largely cosmetic, but it goes much deeper than that.
Well, thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Terry. Let's give Terry Garner, the director of the Clinton Library, a dinner. Mark, there's a lot I like in the book, but I particularly like this story, and you may have touched on it. Mrs. Johnson recalled with some embarrassment seeing a Broadway production of The Grapes of Wrath prior to becoming First Lady, and hearing open sobbing from a member of the audience as the play depicted the family facing their Depression-era travails. Bob, remember The Grapes of Wrath, not very long ago. Only to discover that it was coming from her husband seated next to her. LBJ crying in The Grapes of Wrath. Buy this book, come sign it, and say hello to Mark. Thank you all for being here.